Check 1 2 1 2 1 2. Cool.
Silvana, I'll remove this.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
It's like a live
Okay. Test. All right. Welcome, everyone. We will ask you to just get seated, take your seats, and we will get started. There are some seats here at the front. So many familiar faces. It's nice to see you all here today. Yeah.
Welcome. Shall we start? Hello.
All right, let's get started.
Okay. So, welcome to the Value Change Initiative Net Zero Value Chain Summit with a focus for this edition on enabling collaboration to unlock value chain decarbonization at scale.
So on behalf of the Value Change Initiative, it's our pleasure to welcome you all today. Thank you so much for coming. How are you all feeling? You're good? Wow, okay, yeah, I can hear some excitement. Great, fantastic.
So today, we gather as a community of forward thinkers and change makers, united by our commitment to tackle climate change through transformative action.
Yes, and although it can seem impossible, it can seem many times, but we are all here because we believe that we can tackle Scope 3. We believe that no one can do it alone. And
that we must solve Scope 3 challenges together.
so if you're here today, either in person or the people back home online, is because you have a role to play. You have a role to play in tackling Scope 3. You are here because you probably want to share your ideas, learn from your peers, you want to share your best practices, your learnings. So the only way to do that is diving into the how, diving into the how to Scope 3, diving into those hard implementation challenges that we all face.
So yes, we are here to have the difficult conversations, right? So we are here to embrace complexity, to understand it, and we might not find the solutions, but we're going to get there.
Exactly. So to reach net zero, we need to discuss this topic comprehensively. So today we will build into the discussions and learnings of the Value Change Initiative. We are just coming actually from a claims lab, a full role play on different cases in value chain interventions, and we're really happy to be here. And so today in this event, we will discuss and tackle some key questions that we are dealing with in Scope 3. So how can we build capacity and enable collaboration in value chain intervention? What are the mechanisms and the incentives to scale action?
How can we achieve and claim credible mitigation outcomes when data is inaccurate or transparency is imperfect? Or even, for us, what are the biggest challenges where VCI should focus?
But this conference is not just about presentations and discussions. It's about the conversations in the hallway, getting to know each other, enabling collaboration, and hopefully numerous partnerships to tackle together Scope 3.
And now we would like to get to know you a little bit better. So please join us. Go to /VCI or use a QR code that is in the screen. And we are going to go through some questions live. For the people online, you can also join. My colleagues are going to share the link. So thank you.
Are you all there?
Okay.
Let's go to the first question, Lea.
Let's go to the first question. We're actually on the second. Okay. So the first question, why not, is about expectations. So why are you here today? Some options to understand more about net zero value chains, to gain insights on solutions, to learn from companies' best practice, to meet, share, and discuss Scope 3 stuff, or because you just heard the VCI is the place to be.
See, everyone is excited, responding. See, 77 people logged in, which is fantastic. So I think we have two elements, two main reasons why you are all here. First of all is to gain insights on solutions on the how to Scope 3. And then the second is to meet, share, and network with Scope 3 peers. And a couple of you are thinking that is because that the VCI is the place to be. So thank you all.
Okay.
Shall we go to the second question?
Let's go to the next question. So the next question is, please, in one word, and just one word, tell us what your biggest challenge in achieving net zero value chain is. So there's already some inspiration there: traceability, integrity, financing, complexity, partnerships, claims, whatever. Just one word.
Well, it seems traceability is really at the core. It seems that it's the biggest challenge that doesn't move for any of you. So also some funding, data, collaboration, complexity, where we hope to tackle some of those with the VCI.
Return on investment.
Integrity, yes, we love that. Harmonizing standards, partnerships, yeah. So the first plenary discussion is going to be about that, the standards. Verification, yes. Thank you. Yeah, very exciting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Fantastic. Now, let's go to the third question. So, which solution to achieving net zero value chains do you find most promising today, right? So, shared investments in value chain interventions, regulatory incentives, supply chain partnerships, technology-driven innovations in supply chains, deploying market-based mechanisms, all of the above or none of the above.
Okay, the numbers are moving very fast. All right. It seems that two are the solutions that this group are pushing for or maybe supporting. So one is shared interventions in value chain, shared investments in value chain interventions. And the second top one is supply chain partnerships. Yes, really exciting. I also see, deploying market-based mechanisms as the third point. So the first panel that we will have indeed will dive into the mechanisms to scale action. So we will focus on that also today.
Thank you. Now, the last question, what is the name of your company or your organization? This is just to get to know you better.
Great, so let's see who is in the room. Great, Fairtrade, General Mills, Bayer, Indigo Ag. I love that Sustaincer stays in the middle. It's like everything is rotating, but Mars, great. Conservation International, yes. Fantastic. Limeco, Agoro, yeah. So as you see the names, of course, you know, it's an opportunity for the networking later to see, okay, with whom would you like to speak to today as you're here, and to who you would like to collaborate. So great. Shall we also introduce ourselves, Silvana?
Go for it. So from our side, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Francesca Palamidesi, passionate sustainability advocate, and she's our engagement lead. Francesca thrives in engaging with BCI members and strengthening partnerships.
Thank you, I do. So from my side, I'm really pleased to introduce Silvana Paniagua Tufino, who is our fearless content lead in the VCI and spends her day figuring out those hard questions in Scope 3. So that's her job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Silvana.
Thank you. Now, finally, what about the VCI? Right. So VCI, we are a forum, so most of you are members. Also, some of you might not be yet. So please contact our colleagues of business development, please. So we're a forum of practitioners, including corporates, technical experts, solution providers, standards, frameworks on a mission to achieve net zero value chains, right? So here you can see some of our members.
So practically, we focus on the implementation. We solve cross-sector and sector-specific accounting challenges in Scope 3 and provide a pathway to unlock collective action at scale. And our work is just starting. During the last year, the VCI has grown thanks to you all. We just reached 100 members, 400 representatives worldwide. We publish various pieces, including the technical guidance on food and agriculture and the Scope 3 publication. And we feel really proud of building this Scope 3 movement. And with that, we really aim to strengthen our commitment.
So, because of that, we are consolidating our work on Category 1 and expanding to Category 11. And we're continuing to develop cross-sector solutions on how to Scope 3. I'm also pleased to announce today that we are launching our 4th working group in food and agriculture. So, yeah. Also, and it's starting this November, right? So, also building on the momentum of Climate Week, we have already some members that have joined. So thank you to all these members for leading with example.
Yes, and let's shout them out. Starbucks, USMC, Nutrient, Regrow, ACT, SIBO, Mart, Rabobank, Bayer, LDC, Land O'Lakes, Organic Valley, Agoro, Barry Callebaut, Neutra, with Observers, EDF, and Vera. So thank you all so much for joining so far. We can't wait to go forward with this work and start in November.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, the other announcement we want to make today is that we are happy to also continue our work in the apparel and footwear sector. So that means that we're going to start a new working group next year. So stay tuned.
Exactly. And I think now we are ready to kick off. So thanks for your patience. And so we are happy to call on stage our first speaker. Mars has been a thought leader and relaunched its commitment to net zero. Very exciting news this week. Pledging an additional total $1 billion towards achieving its net zero roadmap, aiming to make 50% cuts in greenhouse gas emissions across its complete value chain by 2050. So today we are here to talk about this new direction and also to talk about how the VCI can help Mars in achieving that. So Kevin Rabinovich, we are happy to call you on stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Also for the people that are behind, there is room here.
Great. We still on? Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Everyone having fun bouncing around Manhattan? And any other daredevils using the city bikes to get around? Let's see some hands. My people, well done. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here and very excited to be part of this initiative and part of these sessions. So I guess maybe I'll start with an observation, which is that the climate's deaf, but it can do math. So the climate doesn't hear anything we say. It doesn't know about our promises. It doesn't know about our commitments. It doesn't know about our targets. It doesn't even know how much money we're spending. It doesn't know about our strategies. It doesn't know about any of that. But it does do math on molecules up and molecules down, right? And at the end of the day, everything else we're doing needs to be in service of that. So we need to not lose sight of, and one might argue we have perhaps lost sight of, that's the thing that matters the most. And so one of the things that we're quite keen to help drive a discussion about and that we think VCI plays an important role in is moving to a space where we're focusing on performance and looking at what's actually happening with results. And I think being able to do good math and good accounting is an important part of that. And so I think that's really where we're very excited to be driving our program, and we're excited about things like VCI that are help pushing in that direction. And so you heard we did publish our net zero roadmap last week, and interestingly, the big headline pickup was the $1 billion commitment, but really the more important thing is the commitment on the GHG results of a 50% reduction by 2030, across our entire value chain, all scopes, everything included. And in a way, the $1 billion is exciting to celebrate as a headline, but in a way it'd be better if it was $500 million, right? Because what matters is not how much we're spending, but how much we're going to drive down our emissions. And so I think it's just a theme we need to keep reminding ourselves and keep pushing ourselves, is that that's really the ultimate objective that we're pushing towards. So with that said, I think I'm supposed to be talking about key levers, which I haven't so far, other than focusing on performance. And so, I'm not going to talk about sort of detailed, specific levers, because that's what all the sessions to come are about. I think the biggest one that has been very helpful for us at Mars, and we've seen some others where this has been very helpful as well, is treat working on net zero the way you would treat any other serious strategic business initiative, right? So there's all kinds of big, audacious, risky gambles that businesses take. They launch into new markets, they launch new products, they buy companies that are startups. There's all these decisions that businesses take which are risky and uncertain, and you go into it not knowing exactly how it's going to turn out and not with everything worked out to the third decimal place. And I think one of the opportunities is for us to, as a community, is to push back on the narrative that we have to have everything figured out to the third decimal place and 30 years into the future before we can get going, right? And so that's where, finding the people in your strategy teams and your finance teams or whatever that you want to engage them in sustainability, but come at them with help me understand how you do what you do, right? Whatever your company's last big strategic initiative where everybody went, ooh, that was bold, right? Find the people that worked on that and figure out how they did it and how did they sell it in. And as an example, I think there's also some really thoughtful ways to frame the engagement with your senior leaders. So, for example, before we published our net zero roadmap, we kind of knew what the target we wanted to set was, but we wanted to go through a whole engagement process and actually build a plan and have a sense for how to do it. And so the conversation we had with our leadership team was around why we think this is the right goal and climate science, which is how we've always built our programs. But the key moment was when we said, the question we want you to ask us is, what would it take to get to 50% by 2030? Don't ask the business, what can you do by 2030? It's a completely different question, right? What would it take? And you get a completely different answer. And people in business are used to the what would it take all the time, right? There's this new market over there I want to launch. What's it going to take to get into that market, right? There's a competitive process for acquiring this exciting new startup. What's it going to take to be the one that wins, right? And I think that's where we need to move to, is more of a what would it take to get to what we all know are the right things from targets and goals. And it just completely changes the mindset and frankly unlocks what is the superpower of business, is get a metric up there, drive continuous improvement, drive performance, create incentives. And so I think there's a real opportunity for pivoting the way we think about and talk about this. And, I think all the work that's going on accounting standards and arguably maybe even more importantly, ways to keep track of interventions and create that flywheel of incentives where you do this, you get to count it, it works for your corporate target. In the case of Mars, it works to the senior leader executive bonuses, which are partially tied to our GHG performance, and that really drives the cycle. And so, with that, I encourage everyone to engage, ask lots of questions, but always be thinking about what's going to be driving performance and making sure we don't get lost in some of the details and we keep that front of mind. So, that.
Thank you, Kevin. So thank you very much for those words. I just wanted to reflect a little bit. It's great, right? We should focus on what matters, so that's important. Also, I love the fact that we should consider and all believe that good accounting matters, right? So that's why we are all here, right? And the last thing that I also want to mention that I think it was super nice is to understand that net zero should be treated strategically also and have this business perspective as well, right? So thank you. Now, after hearing from a company that is leading on Scope 3, we're going to hear about standards and what is cooking right now, right? So we're going to have a panel about the role of standards enabling Scope 3 action and exploring incentives and accounting mechanisms to encourage collective action and collaborations. So it's my pleasure to call on stage the moderator of this panel, my colleague, Thomas Blackburn, our head of business development at SustainCert.
Thank you, Silvana. Thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure and very humbling to have this many people in the room and all of the sort of groundswell of membership that we've seen over the last couple of years. The claims lab we had earlier was really powerful, and I think it really helped people to really understand a lot of the conversation that we're having. I've been in this space for many years, and it's really encouraging to see the sort of progress that we're making. So with that, I should talk about the panel and introduce it. As a New Yorker, I have to say, welcome to New York. I hope you all are having fun. If you have complaints, you can send them to the city council. We all have complaints about New York, but it's a great place to be. I hope you're enjoying it and having a great time. Mars, thank you so much, Kevin, for introducing. I think what's amazing about what Mars has outlined in its net zero and decarbonization strategy is a strategy to back it up and a resource mobilization that covers not only scope 1 and 2, but scope 3, right? And I think that that's fairly unique in what we see in the market today. You know, there are other companies, there are over 6,000, nearly 6,000 that have committed to a science-based target at this point. You know, we do see a lot of progress on scope 1 and 2, but we don't see as much on scope 3. So we're here today to talk about how do we encourage and incentivize action in scope 3. So with that and with this panel, you know, I think we're asking the question, how can we create credible accounting incentives for unlocking scaled scope 3 action? Joining me today to help me ask this question and consider it, we have Pankaj Bhatia from the GHG Protocol, the Global Director. Yeah, you want to come join us? We also have Owen Hewlett, there in the back. Yeah, come on up. All right. The Chief Technical Officer of the Gold Standard and a member of the Technical Advisory Committee for the Science-Based Targets Initiative, Marian Verrill, CEO of SustainCert, as well as Candice Vinke, who is the Senior Director of Nature-Based Innovation at Vera. All right, yeah. Okay, thank you all for being here with me today. I want to jump straight into it because I do want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So if you're thinking about questions for this austere panel, please let us know. Okay, first on challenges, Pankaj, I want to turn to you. The GHG protocol is widely recognized as the leading accounting standard for corporate disclosure. Can you outline a little bit for us what you see as some of the accounting challenges that may be holding companies back in scope 3, and what are maybe some mechanisms that you think companies should be thinking about to achieve their scope 3 goals?
Yeah. Hello, yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for actually starting the session with the very thought-provoking questions in the beginning, and actually Kevin's 10 minutes or so, maybe should have been longer, opening remarks. And I think, in a way, to your first question, I think the answer is provided in what Mars is doing. I think nothing should be holding back companies. Nothing should be holding back companies. Companies should never say that, okay, accounting is not giving us guidance, accounting is confusing, the SBTi targets are too difficult, we cannot meet those goals, and so we are not going to do anything. This cannot be an answer from a good company that is concerned about climate change. And I so really think that, I think as Kevin said, you know, he made some points in the beginning itself that these are some of the concerns, and we know those concerns. You know, accounting can actually fluctuate from one extreme to another extreme. Bean counting, we don't want bean counting. But then we also, I think, if we try to make it principles-based accounting, so not so much rules-based, but principles-based, then we hear also critiques that, and which also are fair and true, that there is no accountability in principles-based accounting. We are seeing that in the implementation of GHG protocol rules, for example, in the scope 2 market-based accounting rules, for example, those, when they were designed in the beginning, there was a lot of excitement at that innovation and the opportunity that it will drive the market, it will drive investments, it will provide some additional incentives. And I think it worked in that manner for the first couple of years. But then it started to deteriorate. I think at least the stories that we have not heard stories how successfully it has been implemented. Mostly, I think the media and critics tend to focus on how badly something has been implemented. And we are aware of those issues. We are aware of those problems. But I think those are fixable to some extent, but we cannot provide all the solutions that the world needs through the GHG protocol or SBTi. A GHG protocol does not have enforcement capabilities. So even if we come up with beautiful rules, that we think will actually ensure full accountability. There is no enforcement. And we even with one of the biggest reporting platform that exists in the world that hosts thousands of reports, and we recently did a check, and we found that companies are able to report, for example, on their scope 2 numbers, market-based numbers, but they do not report whether they have followed the criteria that are required by GHG protocol or not. And that information is not there at all, and nobody is questioning why it's not there. And so there are limitations, and we know there are accounting challenges, but at least our objectives must be always clear. First of all, the math of the molecules. I really like that phrase. I was speaking to, I think, Marian earlier, that math of the molecules. Ultimately, the test is with whatever action you take, whether you follow a standard or you don't follow a standard, whether you are contributing to the reductions that are needed in the world, whether you are making a difference or not, or whether you are just only counting those reductions that are business as usual, or you're counting removals that are already part of the baseline. So that math of the molecules, it does not truly depend on standards. Standards can, of course, provide at least a starting point, but it depends on your implementation. You can do a good implementation even without the standard. So this math of the molecules is important. Then I think it is also important, and that's where the role of market-based approach and the challenges that we face and we need to address is incentives for investment. We have to drive investments. We have to scale investments. And so there is a role for market-based approach. Sometimes, there is suddenly a complete rejection, and I don't agree with it. But we need to understand how to address this, striking a right balance between those companies who will do the right thing, but also there are so many players who may try to game the system. And so it is to strike a balance, and I think those accounting challenges we learn every time now we are going to update our standards, we will make some improvements, but there will never be a perfect answer.
Okay, so striking a balance with the incentives as well as, making sure that we don't have too many bad actors in that system, essentially. Okay, so shifting a little bit away from you and then back to you, Marian. You've been, a part of the Value Change Initiative for 4 or 5 years now. What are you hearing from companies in terms of those incentives that we're talking about? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And building on what Pankaj was just saying, I think what we're hearing from VCI members is really, how do I make sure that I'm going to be recognized for my investments? So what is the return on investment? We want to do what's right for the climate, and we also face an economic reality. So what are the rules of the game that we can use as a company and that our peers ideally would also play by to make sure that everyone is rewarded in a way that's fair, or that we consider it to be fair. So this return on investment question and incentives question is really important. And this is something that we're working on quite a bit, and where we believe the new concept that the Value Change Initiative has pioneered can really play an important role in unlocking that return on investment and making sure that more and more funds flow to decarbonizing supply chains. I think another issue that we face is really that our members really sort of raise all the time is the practicality of the rules. Value chain are changing. So you may buy from one supplier one year and from another group of suppliers the other year. So how do you make sure that interventions that are here to last can continue to generate benefits, even though your supply chain or your sourcing decisions may shift? So we also need to come up with rules that are in line with the realities that corporates are facing. And I think the overarching ask that we hear a lot from VCI members is credibility. If you're investing hundreds of millions, billions to decarbonize and reach a really high, ambitious target, you don't want this to backfire. And you don't want to be criticized for actually being a pioneer and leading the charge on climate change.
Yeah, I agree. Pankaj, you were in the context of that, as essentially incentive structures are being considered in the Value Change Initiative. You were alluding to Scope 2 a little bit there, right? And some of the market-based accounting that GHG protocols put forward before. Are there sort of key lessons there and on safeguards that are essential in those types of systems?
I think there are, and actually thank you to many of you who provided great feedback in the in the survey process that we conducted. We received thousands of comments. and hundreds of proposals. This was the first time, and proposals with some very good suggestions on how to address some of those issues. I think keeping the possibility or the question of enforcement on the side, I think that is a gap that GHG protocol cannot address. But just looking at the criteria, there are at least 2 or 3 lessons that are clearly emerging. One is the lesson on causation, that we need to find a very clear method that companies can use to prove causation to the action and then the reductions coming from the action. Now that could be maybe through some kind of a contractual instrument where there is an instrument that is between the supplier and the user that allocates the rights and responsibilities to report those reductions. There is even further clarity on the issue of additionality, whether additionality should actually be complete total additionality or just financial additionality. That has to be also established. And so these are some of the criteria that we may consider. And there is one other important criteria. I think the critics have been objecting to market-based approach also on the grounds that it does not have any physical connection to companies' actions. So a company could be operating in one grid and it purchases renewable energy credits from another grid. And so the local grid continues to become dirtier and dirtier. And so there is a disconnect. And so there may be some additional criteria that also anchors the market-based approach into some physical parameters like geography, time of use, and like that, as well as additionality criteria and even a contractual instrument. So we still don't know. This will go through a process, and we may still improve this further, I think, but at least the beginning of some understanding, some clarity on what improvements could be helpful here is coming. Yeah.
Okay. And Marion, the VCI members have been considering quite a few of the criteria that Pankaj is outlining, yeah? And thinking about how it may take a systems-based approach to tackle some of those questions, yeah?
Yeah, I think one of the key value add of the VCI is that we're coming up with practical solutions to those challenges, and the goal is really to drive integrity and credibility. So clearly the approach that's been taken is an end-to-end systems approach, so that we can ensure credibility throughout the value chain. And what we realize is that it has to be digitally enabled. I mean, there's no way we can ensure that the impact that's happening in the intervention on farm is translated correctly throughout the value chain, like from the wheat producer to the baguette consumer, without a digitally native approach. So that's what we're working on and what we're building at SustainCert. I think another key concept that unlocks credibility and overcome some of the issues that you mentioned, Pankaj, is to take a proper LCA approach to make sure that the way impacts are being reported in all value chain players' Scope 3 reports are done so properly in line with best-in-class sort of LCA methodologies. What we've coined at SustainCert, one of our new sort of keyword internally is a dual factor verification, which we think is a really powerful way to overcome some of the limitations of market-based mechanism. It's an approach where you verify that the impacts happening on the ground, what the climate sees on the ground in the intervention, that those impacts are real. So that's the first factor verification. And then the second factor verification is that when you verify that the way those impacts are put to use in a corporate Scope 3 report are also in line with greenhouse gas protocol requirements and best-in-class LCA accounting. So there are practical solutions we can come up with to overcome those challenges, yes.
Okay, so Owen and Candice, you all have implemented market-based approaches, essentially, both with Gold Standard and Vera. Can you tell us a little bit about the practicality of implementing some of those things? Also, just how you view your role in this kind of emerging space of potential market-based accounting in Scope 3?
Yeah,
I'm happy to respond. So Vera obviously has a lot of experience working in market-based approaches, and that's partly why we're interested in expanding into Scope 3. Also, of course, it's a huge source of emissions, and we're a mission-driven nonprofit organization that cares deeply about these things. And I've got a team of staff who want to have the greatest impact as possible. So it's a natural space for us to go into, and we feel that we can sort of leverage our experience in the voluntary carbon market for Scope 3. Of course, that comes with some challenges, and there are some differences because of some of the complexity that's already been mentioned with free rider risks and avoiding double counting, and we need to set rules and requirements to sort of safeguard against some of those things to ensure the credibility of the approach. But certainly, whenever we're developing a program, there's a lot of stakeholder input and consultation that goes into it before we make any decisions, and we also talk with other standards bodies to make sure that it aligns with sort of their expectations as well.
Co-founder of VCI, so yeah.
Yeah, well, I think just thinking about our role in this, in sort of gold standard and VCI terms, there's a thought that it springs to mind is that standards, market mechanisms, tools, methodologies, guidance, they're all answers, and the most effective answers, respond to a good question. And I think a lot of the time in this space, we leap to the answer and then try to make a question fit. And I think, some of the earlier attempts at market mechanisms are kind of examples of that. And I think some of the ways the greenhouse gas protocol has been stretched to purposes that it was never originally intended for are kind of examples of that as well. So I think our number one role really is to make sure if we're being asked to provide an answer, whether it's a market mechanism or a standard or a tool or whatever it is, then are we really clear on the question? And when I think about effectiveness of answers, I mean, Kevin said it really well around the atmospheric maths. There's a temptation sometimes, I think, to what's the most impactful in the moment, what affects the maths the most in the moment. But of course, when you're in a complex, kind of says, in a complex space like this, those maths, the atmosphere remembers the maths for quite a long time, and lots of things can come after the fact and mess those maths up again. And voluntary action and voluntary answers of any kind can be really, impactful in the moment, and then have deteriorating effectiveness when, for example, double counting starts to impact on inefficiency, or bad claims start to put people off the mechanism in the first place. See also renewable energy certificates. So I think we have a dual role. Like, are we rushing to an answer without necessarily understanding the question? And is the impact we're having effective? Can we try and predict some of those loopholes? Can we start to make sure the maths adds up permanently, or as permanently as we can make it, I guess, yeah.
Okay. And then is that a conversation you've been having in part of the Beyond Value Chain Mitigation conversation as well for SBTI? And then maybe if you want to speak to AIM as well, and what you're sort of trying to do there and the questions you're trying to answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to start with the question in a way. So the voluntary carbon market in BVCM terms, is a classic answer of classic example of an answer looking for a question sometimes. And I'm a proponent of the voluntary carbon market and a supporter of it, but we don't have to try and make sure it gets used, right? Like we are looking for reasons to use it rather than thinking about what's the question. And the BVCM question really started from okay, so what is the area of responsibility for unabated emissions? So we are working on value chain abatement, the bit that's left over, how do you take responsibility for that? And then you can start thinking about, is a market mechanism right? Are other mechanisms right? So I think BVCM is a really good example of an evolution that we've learned in the last 20 years collectively to, are we asking the right question? And I think it's a really good example of that. I'm not sure we've necessarily got the right answers to it, but at least we're starting.
Tell us what's in, what's out, yeah.
Well, I think that's one of the things it tells us, right, is, as Pankaj mentioned, the forthcoming updates to the greenhouse gas protocol, one of the things that question drives is, are we super clear on what's in and out of the scopes? Because I think there are some grey areas there, and the land guidance has been another journey of finding the right questions to ask. And then AIM similarly, AIM is really looking at that question of, if the question of BVCM is something like how should companies act effectively on their unabated emissions, then AIM is looking at what are effective solutions to value chain abatement. How can we help companies become more effective in value chain abatement? And the tools we have so far, the answers we've given so far are everybody works for themselves on their scopes, right? It's quite a siloed way of thinking. And that is important because it gives you the basis and mapping of your responsibility. But we also need to think about the maths. So if, if everybody works in their silos, is that the most effective, impactful thing for the atmosphere? And so that's where you start to think about, well, what are the barriers and how do you provide those solutions? And how do you do that at a generic level so that the sectors and the specific, locations and contexts can start to do that, specifically?
And I think, Candace, that's a little bit where standards like yours come in, right? There's high-level guidance that can be given, and then, those specific locations, how to account for them, et cetera. That's where like standards like Gold Standard and Vera can kind of come in and help provide additional guidance, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're in the process of developing a Scope 3 program right now that will set sort of a standard level requirements for how we address a variety of issues like permanence and double counting, et cetera. And then that will also be supported by a set of methodologies that we will adapt from the VCS program for use in Scope 3. And we're still deciding which methodologies, but certainly our improved agricultural land management methodology will be one of them, given the huge interest of the agriculture sector.
All right. And then, Pankaj, I'm going to turn it over to questions in just a second. Maybe just a quick round of things that are coming up for everyone. Things are emerging quite quickly. You mentioned your survey. Are we looking at seeing results from that survey or feedback from GHG protocol soon?
Right. I'm hoping that some of you have actually attended the 2 webinars that we have already conducted. The first one was on the Scope 2 updates, feedback summary, and some of the major issues. We just touched upon some of them. Then the summary has also been posted, has been released on Scope 2, feedback summary. All the proposals that we have received, those who agreed for posting on the website, those are posted on the website. Actually, the posting of proposals was very helpful because that has already resulted in interactions with some of those who provided proposals. We are doing informal conversations and dialogues with the proposals that we think have some merits and should be further investigated. And so this is the time when we are analyzing these proposals on Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, and market-based approach. Generally, the thrust of the feedback on Scope 1, corporate accounting and reporting, has been generally the standard has stood the test of the time. It's been there for more than 20 years. No major changes needed. So it is stable. If at all there are some changes, I think, is in the consolidation approach. And we're also somewhat waiting to see what SEC comes out of in their standard on setting organizational boundaries. If they pick and choose one approach, then that might give us some guidance also in the GHG protocol. But overall, corporate accounting and reporting standard is stable and likely not going to see like major revisions. Scope 2, market-based approach, will likely see some changes. In Scope 3 also, the feedback has been generally stable. The 15 categories are going to stay. We have not learned about any new category that we were missing. So that was a good thing. A lot of feedback has been on subcategorization to drill down further to create a little more subcategories. Some feedback on investment category number 15. So that will be an improvement. And then overall, a thrust on market-based approach and application of market-based approach in Scope 3. Then market-based approach itself, we decided to present it as a 4th work stream. The reason is, first of all, I think our partner initiatives like Gold Standard and VCI and Vera, we think that there may be some joint guidelines that we may seek to publish on application of market-based approach, common guidelines for all the 3 standards. And we may also, in that process, understand how to integrate market-based approach in all the 3 standards. And so right now it is a separate work stream, and we will be presenting it on 3rd of October. So those who can join, there's a webinar where we will do a presentation. Now, just I will say one more thing, that along with all this, we also are revamping our governance setup. We generally will have a multi-stakeholder governance process established for each standard uniquely, and just for that, and then that is dissolved. But now we will have some more long-term permanent governing bodies, so there will be a board for the GHG protocol, there will be an independent standards board, so a board will be called steering committee, and then independent standards board is the committee that will actually have a lot of decision-making power on the standards, and there will be technical working groups for each of the 4 work streams. Yep, that's all.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Owen, things that are coming up for you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we have a beyond value chain mitigation program. So trying to the SBTI's guidance on that will come out later in the year, and we'll have a kind of how-to roadmap manual to go with that, and that will cascade into our own standards, where things like carbon markets will further align with it to make sure that they are best practice. On the Scope 3 side, there's already a standards development process for gold standard projects, existing and new, to be used for that purpose, which, as Candace said, implies lots of changes to how data is presented and the criteria for that. So at our level, I think quite a lot going on, and then moreover, through the work with Pankaj's team and with the SBTI team and the technical council, trying to frame those questions really well, and that's where I think we've continued to work with VCI to provide the right answers, I guess. And then AIM. There's a big governing committee meeting tomorrow, which I'm obviously looking forward to. And then that guidance, the first guidance for that should come out by the end of the year, is the plan.
All right. Marriott?
And yeah, one more piece of guidance coming up from, from the VCI this year in October. We'll update the VCI rules and requirements. The team has been working really hard on that, taking members' feedback, users' feedback to produce a guidance that will be clearer and more specific. And from a sustainability perspective, there's a race going on in the background. I don't know if you're aware, but the first impact units are going to be issued very soon. So we'll have some real case studies on how you can create ROI for your value chain intervention investments, co-claim, co-invest to accelerate action. So we'll report back on that before the end of the year.
All right. Candace?
Yeah, great. So a few things. So we are currently in the process of selecting the members of our Scope 3 program development group. I know there's some folks here who have applied, so we hope to notify people soon who will be part of that group. And we are beginning to draft rules and requirements as part of our new Scope 3 standard. And the idea is to bring it to that group to get their input as we go along. Our goal is to have a draft done in the next year or so, and then begin piloting in the second year before we finalize it. So that's some of our immediate term plans.
All right. And I think it's great to have you all here, and it's amazing to sort of have the collaboration and some of the sort of, cross-pollination of concepts and ideas across everyone. Alignment is what we need, right? And with that, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Wow, okay. One person ready, yeah. Sai is bringing a mic over.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks everyone for your comments and your leadership. To the points that were made about enforcement and getting credit, historically there's a precedent for high ambition standards that are voluntary, such as the ones you work with, to inform the formal international standard system, namely ISO, for example. I'm curious if you are doing any work to connect your efforts to the international formal standard system and how you view these standards creating more enforceable industry-wide mechanisms.
Yeah, you want to take that one? Yeah.
So we we used to have an MOU with ISO. Actually, we worked over almost 20 years now since the publication of the first standard with ISO very closely, and they adopted GHG protocol standards for ISO 14064 Part 1, Part 2 series. And then there was a period of time when they made revisions and they moved away from the scopes framework and they changed it to another framework. And so most recent conversations that we have been having, they are going back, or maybe I think in the drafts they have already changed it back to the scopes framework, because that's how the business all over the world is now reporting their impact. So that's a very good sign that ISO will be completely aligned with the GHG protocol. But I still think that the point I was making about enforcement is still not addressed by ISO. I think part of the enforcement is setting up of registries. For example, I was speaking to some stakeholders on biogas. And so the suppliers of the biogas and the users, it's a voluntary registry, but that's the only way that they can get certificates. It's a common system that everybody gets to see. I just wonder, for example, for reporting of removals also there should be a registry, reporting of any market-based instrument should there be a registry. So that's kind of a step towards a more rigorous enforcement.
I think there's the other standards group that's really interesting is the ICEAL members, so your fair trades and your FSCs and that group. And we tend not to think of them so much when we come to greenhouse gas reporting because they're traditionally more sustainable practices and sustainable processes, facilities, commodities. But actually, one way to read that group is they are often market-based mechanisms themselves. So that's really the group that has pioneered and in some cases really got right things like mass balance approaches and book and claim approaches. So again, to my kind of question answer thing, trying to look at like a crediting based mechanism and force fitting that into the greenhouse gas protocol is one way of looking at it, not an easy way, it has to be said. But like I say, there are also these commodity-based standards that, yes, okay, setting aside the specificity of sustainable forest practices, their chain of custody models, for example, are very interesting, I think, to learn from.
For tracing the physical good. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Karen. All right.
To anybody on the panel. Two questions. Number one, so SBTI is going to be doing a Scope 3 standard or discussing a Scope 3 standard. And so if you were to look in your crystal ball, how do you think that's going to wind up impacting BCI, Vera, with your Scope 3 program? How are you keeping your eye on that? What's going to happen? Second question is, it seems like ISO 14068 is late to the table. I don't know. And tracking that, what can we expect out of ISO 14068 and how will that's the carbon neutral one, how will that impact the net zero conversation?
Anybody want to take that one?
I think the second one I can't, but the SBTI, so for those who didn't pick up on it, SBTI announced a Scope 3 task force earlier in the year. So I think that'll go ahead. The scope of it, still TBD. My hope for it would be that it looks not so much at setting a standard, because I think that's built on the greenhouse gas protocol's work, and should go in lockstep with that. But to think more about how does the effectiveness of the tools to serve that that intent, how does SBTI facilitate that? So we have this kind of sometimes is the target the thing that should own a mechanism, or is it the inventory standard that should own the mechanism? And I think that space is where we can start to unpack some of that. So my hope for it is that it'll bring a lot of clarity on the different roles of the parts of the ecosystem and start to address some of the difficult questions like where does it, is the market-based mechanism in the inventory? Is it adjacent the inventory? Is it on SBTI's side? Is it on the green? Those kind of questions I think would be my hope that it starts to think about.
Yeah. I can talk maybe briefly about ISO. So the last time I checked in, they're more so focused on claims, right, and carbon neutral claims. I think that's the one you're referring to. Yeah, and I think since then there's been a bit of an evolution in claims, and there's a bit ongoing debate on compensation and contribution claims. So it'd be interesting to circle back and see where they stand on that. But the last time I looked, they were looking at a similar approach following the mitigation hierarchy, looking at residual emissions and compensating with credits. So I think the part that relates to Scope 3 is whether or not they'll allow a market-based mechanism to achieve your abatement target for that claim.
And maybe on the impact on the VCI, I think the decision we've taken with our members is that we can't wait for all the rules to be clear before we move forward. So we're moving forward in a good intelligence and good collaboration with SBTI, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and the standards to share what we've learned. The traceability issue is here. It's not going to go away, and we have to solve for that. So we're coming up with options, solutions on how to do that in a way that's high integrity, high transparency. And this will inform and is informing already the work that's happening within the SBTI and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And we're agile enough so that we can adapt our rules, our requirements, our systems to take on any new guidance or any new requirements that would come from those standards. So that's really the operating model, but we cannot let perfection get in the way of action. So we need to act and act now.
All right. Any other questions? Be brave. Yeah.
No problem being brave, right, Thomas? Thank you so much, esteemed panel. I have a question that's complement to Karen's question. I promise we haven't coordinated. When we think about the removals and reductions and the actual value chain in initiatives, sometimes the companies also reflect on the fact that they may not have to yet do scope 3. They look to SEC rules, they look to the California bills that recently were passed that have pushed out scope 3 disclosures. They have pushed out those requirements for companies. How are you feeling that will impact our scope 3 value chain work, if at all? Will it speed things up? Will it slow things down? Will it have no impact?
Yeah. You want to take that one? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure whether the information is correct. Maybe somebody else can confirm. But I thought California bill requires all three scopes: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. This is my understanding.
I think it's 2027 or something. Yeah.
Okay. So I will go back to the original discussion that we were having. Is what motivates companies, I think. And is it the standards and the regulations that they're waiting for? Don't they see the writing on the wall? Don't they see that what is coming, both in terms of the public reactions as more and more climate change impacts become clear, and also the competitive opportunities that are also, I think, becoming clear? If you go to Apple's website, they're introducing this iPhone series, and one of the big 3 advancements, means I was so amazed. It's like they're landing on the moon with iPhone 15. It's like, carbon neutrality claim. It is one of their biggest label on there. Why are they doing it? They must have read the market, I think. And there are markets, and I think there are people in markets who will make buying decisions. And so I think companies that are going to wait for the regulation or for some other incentive will likely miss the mark. And I think even regulators, I think the scope 3 reporting requirement is also showing progress. ISSB is another international standard, and they require scope 3. I think in the first reports to be submitted by 2025, scope 3 is required.
All right. Any other comments? No? Okay.
Yeah, no, just supporting that. And in Europe, scope 3 is part of CSRD. So it's not whether scope 3 is going to be mandated, it's more when. And in some jurisdictions, it's as early as 2025.
All right. Any other questions? Yeah? Thanks, Sai, for helping with the microphones.
Thank you very much for an excellent conversation. My question is around the question of traceability and accounting challenges. I've seen this year in particular many new companies coming with data solutions that I couldn't have dreamt of a couple of years ago around scope 3. And they really get at those problems and I think improve the accuracy of the scope 3 data and the visibility into the value chain. So while it is not yet 100% accurate, I'm wondering if making leapfrogs with people from data science and the world of supply chain and finance may change your approach or create new approaches in what you are developing, thanks to improved traceability.
Yeah, sure. And your name and?
Damien with NG Impact.
Okay, great. Anyone want to talk about the role of technology in supply chain traceability? Yeah? Yeah?
Yeah, no, certainly we've also noticed that there's a lot of new tech companies that are improving traceability or have sort of methods that they feel they can improve traceability. And I think that we've been highly supportive of exploring that. We've had several calls with some of these technology providers to better understand what they can and can't do. And I think that even though Vera is exploring a market-based approach right now, if you can improve traceability, we certainly would like to incentivize that. And we are thinking about ways already within our program how we may be able to drive greater traceability over time. There are ways through deductions that we could add in cases where you lack traceability that would incentivize it, that we're considering in our program design.
All right. Another question? Oh. Hi.
Thanks so much. Martha Stevenson with WWF. So
you know, Owen, I was thankful that you brought up all the learnings from the commodity-based certifications, because I do think we have a deep evidence basis there, and we even have the Evidencia database that ICL houses. WWF's contributed a ton to looking at this. As you all are designing these mechanisms, how are you bringing that evidence base to bear on the design of what you're looking at? Question one. Question two, as we roll these out, how are you all making sure we have the impact evaluations in place to be sure that we are actually having a net climate impact and not just moving finance around?
All right. Good questions. Thank you, Martha. You want to, yeah?
Take a bit of both, actually. Yeah, I think on this, just on the second one, I mean, Pankaj used the example of renewable energy certificates, and in a way, the lack of response to the increasing evidence base that they weren't working, I think, is, you know, something that we can reflect on. And, you know, the improvements in governance, one of those improvements for a good system, and ICL recommend that, is that continual loop of reflection on evidence and stakeholder feedback. So we have examples where mechanism design, in good faith, thinking you're answering a thoughtful question, didn't work, but you know, it's okay to not answer a question well. It's not okay to just leave that answer out there for another 20 years, right? So I think good governance is the answer to dealing with the evidence base as it comes in. In terms of the evidence base from Evidencia and from ICL, I mean, one of the things we've been trying to do, so Gold Standard's an ICL member, and one of the reasons we joined was to try and give back, and to give back to the ICL community is almost to bring them into the conversation. So, you know, not just the evidence itself, but the way they collect evidence and reflect on it is something that we can learn from. So we're very tunnel vision on carbon accounting, and we don't think very well, I think, about how we can learn from the process along the way. So there's a lot of evidence-based learning in terms of, you know, what are the most effective solutions, what are the most effective ways to account. But I think just bringing in that community to bring the evidence with them, rather than show us your evidence, we'll interpret it, I think is really important.
Yeah. And to your second question, adding to what Owen just mentioned, how do we make sure we're really having an impact here? It's the purpose of the dual factor verification, dual factor authentication that we're developing within the VCI and applying with our partners at SustainCert. So it's an approach where you verify and confirm that positive change is really happening on the ground. The problem we had with Scope 2 is that those renewable energy sites were already producing renewable energy. There was just nothing was really changing other than someone would benefit from the positive claim. So we confirm that positive change is happening on the ground. As Owen said, the methodologies are revised and reviewed continuously so that we always adhere to the new science, acknowledging that yesterday's methodologies are not as good as tomorrow's, and that's part of the game. And then the second factor authentication is make sure that the way those impacts are being used by corporates is actually in line with what we want to see, and in line with the rules and requirements that are coming out of the standards, and actually reflect accurate claims on the corporate side. And so we really need to work at those two levels, make sure that real change is happening on the ground, and that the claims, the way those impacts are actually being reported by corporates, is in line with best practices.
Can I add one point? On your first question, we're actually in an active process right now of having a series of calls with auditors in sort of the chain of custody space, and certainly would welcome any further names, because we did recognize as well the huge amount of expertise. So we've identified a sort of short list of people we'd like to consult as we figure out how we're going to define this for our program, and have already started interviewing folks in that space that are not conventional sort of carbon creditor auditors, which we're more familiar with.
All right.
And the VCI actually did run a working group with ICL members, specifically focused on making those of, like, facilitating the knowledge transfer, and we'd love to do that again, surely, yeah.
Okay, we do have 5 more minutes if anyone else wants to ask a question. Yeah, Andrew, Pure Projet, I'll introduce you while you're waiting for Andrew Nobrega from Pure Projet.
Thank you. The longer it takes, the more introduction, right? That's great. Thank you very much. First of all, very excited about all the evolutions, you know, from 2 or 3 years ago to where we've come, and all the announcements that are forthcoming. It's all really exciting. One of the questions that we haven't discussed, or you haven't discussed today, is about governments. You know, we see the evolution of the inventory accounting pathway that you've all discussed today, the alignment of frameworks that are aligning with Scope 3 emissions reporting. we know there's that discussion of NDCs and how a project-based accounting system may interact with Article 6, etc. When we start to look at Scope 3 reporting, now you're talking about inventory accounting. You also see actions like Leaf Emergent working on jurisdictional approaches, which is a different parallel pathway to addressing the NDC. So maybe if you could comment a little bit on how you see government engagement going forward on this topic. Is this something that project developers should be thinking about, that the methodologies themselves may incorporate, or that certification systems may create those linkages and pathways?
Yeah, sure.
This is a very good question, and I think perhaps this is ultimately where the real consolidation, convergence, and scale is going to occur, and hopefully occur sooner than later. I think we were hoping SEC's adoption in the US will provide the leadership globally on how corporate disclosure should occur on Scope 1, 2, and 3. I'm quite disappointed, actually. I think California news is still a positive outcome if they say 27, but I hope SEC still also is able to come out because they will set the benchmark. Maybe Europeans will set the benchmark in this case if they already require Scope 3. What I have understood in my conversations that the governments are actually deeply engaged with the industry, almost in most countries. I was recently in Germany, and I was speaking to the government officials for another part of GHG protocol's work, which is on country-level accounting. Not many people know there's a standard on mitigation gold standard for NDC accounting and also long-term strategies. And the conversation was, we need to update it because countries are also establishing net zero goals, and there are some intersections between corporate and countries. And the whole time, they kept asking me about corporate level accounting and Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope SPTI. And I said, I didn't come for this. I really wanted to discuss the other part of the GHGP work. And they said the German industry and the German finance ministry, they are meeting almost on a weekly or monthly basis on how the industry can be on the pathway of decarbonization and net zero, how they can be successful in SPTI, how they can be scale up in their participation in SPTI, how they can be successful in the implementation of SPTI. And so just to provide that background, but I think you're right, that's where we need to focus on next phase. Yeah, thank you.
I think Andrew's work, I know, takes in a lot of least developed country context as well. And one thing I think we need to think about when we're thinking about flexibility and market mechanisms is both capacity support and development for those countries to take advantage of it, but also to be safeguarded. Because to give a bit of an extreme example, take the rubber industry. Liberia has vast rubber plantations. Imagine somebody invents some alternative to rubber, but it's like SAF, only available in some parts of the world, say Switzerland. Then buyers start paying for that technology, but still emitting and clearing in Liberia. And eventually that technology takes over, and the Swiss have benefited from that investment, and the zero emissions are in Switzerland, and Liberia is still left with a wreck and a shell of a rubber industry. So we do have to be a little bit careful about not just the GHG effects, but also the kind of safeguarding for where you're reporting your emissions and where you're investing, but who's still got the actual emissions, right?
All right. Any other points to add? Maybe one more question? Sure. I'm sorry, I can't introduce you. Sai? Should I? Oh. All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your comments. It's been really, really helpful. I wanted to bring the conversation just briefly back to the ISO system that was raised earlier. There's been some points raised about alignment of standards, about accountability, and also points made about sort of developing countries and the needs of emerging economies. The ISO system has national standards bodies in every country in the world, pretty much. And these standards bodies also have counterpart accreditation bodies in every country in the world. They're separate institutions: ISO, International Standards Organization; IAF, International Accreditation Forum. And the entire point of those institutions is to develop standards that reflect the views and market needs of that country. this institution, this sort of framework, this quality infrastructure, as I believe it's called, is something that already exists. And another thing that's worth mentioning is that in the case of these ISO standards bodies, around 80% of them are part of their national government. They are effectively government departments funded by their government precisely for the purpose of developing standards. What worries me when I hear comments and discussions like today is that a huge amount, a phenomenal amount of really, really good work and consensus building and best practice development is happening without reference and without connection to this system. And when we talk about things like scaling, accountability, reflecting different views, are we missing a trick by not taking good enough advantage of a system that already exists?
So maybe my previous answer was not complete. I think you're pushing in the right direction. ISO has amazing infrastructure. No other standard setting body has that kind of an infrastructure and acceptance, automatic acceptance, particularly in developing countries. And we are in regular conversations with ISO. In fact, I just recently went to their headquarters in Zurich. We have started a conversation on a number of issues. With ISO, on the one hand, this is a huge opportunity. It's a very valuable asset. But I think they also have one problem, maybe two, but one is a bigger problem. Generally the ISO standards, at least in the GHG accounting space I've seen, are driven by very strong industry interest, very, very strong. And that also in some cases, the country representatives who are sent, the delegations, in some cases are the GHG intensive sectors, the steel, the oil and gas, and they come with a agenda. Now, of course, business has an agenda and we want to support that agenda. But if you have only that stakeholder represented in the process, then there is a huge risk. And so this has been one communication that we have said that we would really like to see a collaboration between GHG protocol and maybe eventually a convergence, and maybe even GHG protocol doesn't need to exist. ISO takes over. But they have to solve this problem of a multi-stakeholder process. And second, they have to make their standards free. They charge, and in developing countries, I think they should really provide them free. And so they're working on both these issues. Thank you.
And what I would add to that, I mean, from a VCI perspective, we're not opposed to working with ISO and have ISO or other standards take over the work. What we're building here is an innovation framework. So we're creating rules and solving problems that no one has solved before. And the fact that the ISO 14068 standard is about to be released shows that the ISO timelines are just not timelines that we can work with in the context we are right now. And so it'd be amazing if ISO could pick up the work, but if that means waiting for 5 years before companies take action, that's just not realistic. So we are moving forward, we're solving the problems, and we're very happy for international standards to pick up the work and do their sort of role as standards body, but we need to innovate and solve the problems that corporates are facing today. And back to Andrew's question, which I will, I think, put back to Owen. What I understood from you, Andrew, is the VCM and Scope 3 have sort of come to an agreement on key issues like double counting. If you issue a carbon credit from an agriculture project in the VCM, you cannot claim a Scope 3 reduction. So we sort of went ahead a little bit of the Article 6 and compliance space. Are we going to have, do you think, Owen, the same conversation with Article 6 and with governments? Are we going to have a clear cut that if there's a NITMO and Article 6 units issued from Liberia, sort of agriculture program, is that going to prevent companies from claiming Scope 3? Are we going to have the same conversations, do you think, or not?
Everything ends up in double counting eventually, doesn't it? It does with me anyway. I think you have to have that conversation. I think if we're looking at effective, impactful mechanisms and the maths adding up, then you have to have that conversation, because double counting, where it's pernicious, has two effects. It undermines the efficacy of what you're saying. So what you reported is no longer true. What you claimed is no longer true. And it undermines the efficiency of the finance. And both of those things, the claim is why you're doing this. And we've all said we need to scale up finance. So if we're scaling up inefficient finance, whose fundamental basis for being is, the efficacy is challenged, then we have to deal with double counting, I think. I think where we, to be honest, get to, maybe provocatively, is that the mechanism that focuses on that needs a unique claim, whether it's offsetting or ITMO, that's really the outlier. That's the pain point, and they're not very collaborative mechanisms. Offsetting and ITMOs aren't very collaborative. Actually, they require only one entity, country, government to use it, and so part of me is also, should we not just stop doing that and think about only things that can play well together rather than have to have difficult infrastructure to deal with? But that's a bigger conversation than VCI can solve. Yeah.
All right. With that, I mean, I think, speaking to what matters is the molecules, right? And a little bit of wouldn't it be better if it was 500 million instead of a billion? Making sure that the finance is efficient, right? So with that, I'm going to wrap this panel. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Really illuminating to hear about what's coming and all the work that you all are doing to support incentivizing Scope 3 action. So it's great to have you all here. And I'll hand it back to our, let's thank our panelists. Yeah. And I will hand it back to Francesca.
Thank you so much, Pankaj, Owen, Candace, Marion, and of course, Thomas. Very enlightening discussions. I saw lots of faces nodding and interested and lots of notes, and it's great. It means that we are asking the right questions and we organize the right events and opportunities, right? So now it's time to break into the three breakouts. So we have organized three panel discussions. One is going to be on food and agriculture, value chain interventions. One is going to be on net zero fashion, focusing on the apparel conversations. And another one will be on claims, on credible co-claiming. So we can now head into the breakouts. We have actually 1 hour, so we are good on timing. And so I'm going to call the other event organizers. So for those of you who wants to go into the breakout on food and agriculture, maybe you can start going. Sorry, just looking at, okay, someone that can guide people outside. Yeah, okay, Sai? Okay, yes, okay. So if you're interested on the food and ag discussions, please go with my fellow colleague, Sai. For those of you who are interested on the apparel ones, please follow Laurent, the blonde French man there. And for those on claims, please stay here. Yes.
The first session is here or the third session is here?
The claims is here. We will get started. For those of you who are going to stay here talking about co-claiming, please take your seats. And I'm going to call out our panelists. All right, so this is going to be an interesting conversation on co-claiming. Value chain impact, the credible way. So yes, I'm happy to introduce on the floor Martha Stevenson, WWF and SBTI advisor, Michelle Nutting from Nutrien, Autumn Fox from Marts, Dr. Kai Nino Streicher from SustainCert, and Michelle from Nestlé. All right, so I think we are missing Autumn. Okay. So while we get comfortable, why don't you all come just a bit closer so we just can have a bit more kind of intimate conversation on claims. And for the people online, please just be patient with us. All right. All right, so I'm gonna just start with a bit of introduction. What are we talking about? So, well, I think it was an interesting discussion so far. The plenary, market-based mechanisms, criteria, safeguards, lots of aha moments. So following the discussions on accounting mechanisms and how to encourage action and collective action, we want to now look a bit more about the credible claims and credible co-claiming. So, well, what's the issue, right? Let's start with that, first of all. So we have identified with the VCI a couple of critical issues, and I'm sure you are all quite familiar with. Of course, you may have seen the research published by the European directive proposals on green claims, mentioning that 53% of green claims give vague, misleading, and unfounded information. 40% of claims have no supporting evidence, and half of all green labels offer weak or non-existing verification. So of course, when we look at those numbers, it's quite high numbers, isn't it, in terms of this piece on greenwashing. So, and of course, there are lots of risks being generated in terms of credibility risks, losing credibility as a company, right? Losing trust from investors, consumer, and market, accountability risks, and also reputational. And of course, the issue on double counting and double claiming and free riding. And we are coming out from the claims lab just earlier. And my table, actually, we discussed a lot about free riding and, thank you, and co-claiming. So the work of the VCI, where we build on the latest IZEA piece on company landscape action claims, gold standard, you have heard ISO, SBTI, and the requirements from different regulations. And so this year we launched a new claims lab, and we currently focusing on new definitions and criteria on how to address the implementation of co-claiming, mitigation outcomes to improve the understanding of claiming. So what do we mean? Maybe first of all, in terms of co-claiming, what's the issue at stake for those of you who are maybe new to this space? With co-claiming, we mean impacts generated by emissions reductions and or removals in value chain interventions that can be either claimed by one or multiple organizations or driven by an actor where impact is transferred among eligible co-claimants. So the key questions is, of course, how can we accelerate, how can we scale action, and basically, how can we enable credible co-claiming and co-investments, as we just heard from the earlier panel discussion. So I would like to just give time for a quick round of introduction from our esteemed speakers. Thank you for being here. It's great to talk about this important topic today with all of you. So maybe I'll start with Martha. Let's just do a quick round, and then we can dive into the discussion.
Sure. Just so background and kind of, okay, great. So Martha Stevenson, I'm with the World Wildlife Fund. I'm on the forest team. And today I've been asked to kind of think across multiple frameworks that I've been involved in, including development of the SBTI forest, land, and agriculture guidance, serving on the advisory committee for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Land Sectors and Removals Guidance, and also the SBTN, the Science Based Targets Network, which is developing a series of nature-based claims across freshwater, land systems, oceans, and also biodiversity. And I'll tell you kind of the thread through all of this, total bias toward land, and I'll like fake it till I make it on everything else.
Thanks, Martha.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Autumn Fox. I am with Mars. So you heard from my manager, Kevin, earlier today. So I'm part of his corporate environment team, and I'm looking after our commitments on climate, land use or land occupation, and deforestation.
Thank you very much. So hi everyone, I'm Kai. I'm the Director of LC and Data Science at SustainSort, and we're basically working on products that can digitally enhance like co-claiming and co-investment. So very happy to speak about the kind of solution that we have in offer and how they are enable credible co-claiming.
Thanks, Kai.
Hi, my name is Michelle Zollinger. I'm with Nestle. I'm the Global Sustainable Sourcing Lead for Pulp and Paper, but also have a climate role. So do a lot of our work around removals. Yeah, I'm part of the global team, but located in the US, and excited to be on this panel. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Michelle. And on the Michelle line, we got the other speaker.
Is this microphone working? Yes. Okay. Apologies for being late. There was some confusion as to which panel I was on, so.
You are to the right one.
If we're just doing quick introductions as to who I am. My name is Michelle Nutting, and I am an agronomist. I work for Nutrien. Nutrien is a crop inputs company, basically everything that a farmer needs to grow a crop. And I am the Director of Agriculture and Environmental Sustainability. Nice to be here.
Thank you. All right, then let's get started. I would like to start with Martha. You know, considering the latest work with WWF in terms of claims, so but also beyond that, like looking a bit more at the long-term impacts, right? So can you tell us a bit more, Martha, on the theory of changes that WWF has been putting forward, and what's your perspective there? What's happening, and where are we going?
Don't know where we're going, but certainly can tell you where we've been. So WWF, we work primarily with the market transformation theory of change, and this aligns with the IPCC, right? So I want everyone to close their eyes, imagine special report on 1.5, figure 2.5, right? What do we need? We need deep emission reductions and then a balancing, not a balancing and then deep emission reductions. Again, it's deep emission reductions and then a balancing at the end. Within that deep emission reductions, there are 4 system transformations that we need to enable. Those are energy, transport, land, and industrials. And so that kind of across all of these spaces and all the various standards development that WWF engages in, we're really looking at enabling these 4 system transitions, and then also enabling not just in supply chain action, those things that companies can affect because they have a direct contractual relationship, either ownership over their operations or a contractual relationship with their supply chain. But we also know that when you just focus on in supply chain activity, you can't address drivers. Drivers have to be addressed at a landscape scale, but not just landscape scale, seascape scale, basin scale, electricity grid scale, right? So but it's a both and strategy, and so you see that show up. So you see, you know, our work on the Science Based Targets Initiative, on renewable energy goals, but then also the Buyers Alliance that we help to set up with other partners, right? You see our work on MSC, really making sure that we have sustainable fisheries, but then also how does the jurisdictional approach scale within these seascapes to make sure that we're taking care of marine protected areas, et cetera, and not just relocating problems. So I think that kind of both and strategy is what you see consistently across WWF's work. When it comes to the claim space, this is when things get really tricky because we know that we need these collective scaled approaches to get at the main drivers that we're trying to solve issues. But we also know that there's this kind of healthy tension and that companies need an ability to claim whatever contribution or attribution they are making to these outcomes in order to make a case for it internally. And I think that is kind of the main tension all of us are here trying to solve specifically. They drill down into the flag work in particular. So this is, again, the Science-Based Targets Initiative's pathways on forest, land, and agriculture. There are many activities within that data that all occur directly on working land. So if we're looking at the soils improvement, forest management improvement, the agricultural emissions, manure management, et cetera, that is primarily occurring on working lands. When we look at the restoration wedge, increasing silvopasture, integration of tree systems within grazing systems or other agricultural systems, now we're talking about edge treatments, we're talking about riparian zones, we're talking about lands that are adjacent to these working lands. Same with deforestation. We can do some of that work within the supply chain on those direct working lands, but to address drivers on deforestation, you really have to be working at the landscape scale. And so I think that is the space right now that we're trying to figure out between the greenhouse gas protocol, where the boundary ends, between beyond value chain or any other kind of complementary mechanism. How can we make sure that we're incentivizing all of these actions to get to the outcomes we need while still providing the incentive structures that companies have internally? On the Science-Based Targets Network, so these are the nature targets within the land systems. I don't know how many folks have had a chance to look at this, but we kind of learned from carbon and where we've created this very complex system and tried to fix it on the outset on the nature side. And so if you look at the land targets, what you have is target 1, zero deforestation target, zero conversion. Target 2 is a land occupation reduction target. Target 3 is a landscape engagement target that complements those first 2 targets. And what we're doing is putting the kind of direct in supply chain action in the same incentive structure as the landscape action, so then the 2 aren't fighting each other, because I think a lot of the complexity right now is the different systems are fighting each other because they're on different sides of the line right now. So that's the issue.
Thank you, Martha. It's an interesting conversation, and I mean, there are so many moving pieces, isn't it, in the landscape, and sometimes with all these acronyms, it's like, okay, all right, there is another standard or another framework. No, but it's really great because I mean, what you said is it's more about the long term, right? What we are achieving, a large scale, and how can we drive towards that. So, Martha, just to follow up with you, in terms of claiming, in terms of performance, would you be able to just share a bit more your perspective on co-claiming value chain abatement and the beyond value chain mitigation piece? We already talked about BCBCM, and could you share some more insights with us?
I can. I mean, right now, again, we're in this difficult space because the greenhouse gas protocol land sector guidance is not completed yet. We don't know where that boundary ends, and we don't know where anything is beyond value chain. So I think until we resolve that, we're still kind of in this holding pattern. I don't want that to hold action, right? Like WWF usually uses language of no regrets action, like get started, we need it yesterday, like keep going, don't wait for the accounting. So again, just to kind of name the tension, but I would say, you know, WWF and I think others on the panel helped contribute to the ICL work, looking at attributional, you know, jurisdictional based claims. What are the activities and the types of claims that activities can be linked toward, and are very supportive of looking at attributional claims, contributional claims, and being very clear about, you know, when there is attribution, let's make sure that companies have the rights to that attribution. And I think that's something we included in the flag guidance, making sure that as you're working with either landholders, smallholders, people who are working the land, that you are using the tools of free, prior, informed consent to make sure that you're respecting the rights and the needs of these people. So I think that's something that is super important to make sure that we're pulling forward through this conversation. And then, I mean, I really like contribution-based claims. I like putting the collective outcome of the initiative first and saying, me as a company contributed to this. I know it doesn't work for everybody, but I think we could, in my perfect world, we would do jurisdictional-based accounting and kind of forget tracing everything down to the last minute. I know that doesn't work for selling it inside companies, but if we could do that and then work together to get the outcome to really move the needle, that would be my perfect world. But unfortunately, I understand that doesn't work for others. So we are stuck here having these conversations.
Yeah, and especially coming from the land sector removals guidance workshop last week in Washington. Very exciting discussions. I heard.
Long time having these conversations.
Exactly. Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Martha. So you did mention, also the role of the companies. Now let's look a bit about the companies here on the panel. Michelle, I would like to go to Nutrien as fertilizer producer in terms of crop inputs and services, and you're the world's largest company, right, in terms of crop inputs. And so in terms of your scope 3 upstream and downstream emissions, Nutrien's main emissions related to fertilizers released are basically related to category 1, 3, and 11. But of course, as we know, and we are already a bit unpacking the topic, there are lots of skepticism in terms of claims. So Michelle, could you tell us a bit more your experience? We mentioned flag. What are your specific strategies in terms of SBTI flag, and what is Nutrien doing in terms of enhancing credibility in terms of climate claims?
Thank you, Francesca. Just a couple of really easy questions to get started. Okay, so for Nutrien, let me just start with what is our climate ambition as a company. We are a major fertilizer manufacturer, and so as a result, we have this scope 1 and 2 footprint, the majority of which occurs as a result of nitrogen fertilizer manufacturing. So that's about 70% of our footprint in total. And we have a few goals that I wanted to just highlight. So in 2023, we had set a goal to reduce our emissions by 1 million metric tons in nitrogen fertilizer manufacturing. And we're on track to achieve pretty close to that 1 million metric tons of emission reduction in 2023. We also set a goal to have a 30% emission reduction on an intensity basis of our scope 1 and 2 for nitrogen production by 2030. And that's a very challenging goal. So we're continuing to evaluate regularly what's our track to be on pace to achieve that goal. What are the gaps? How do we get there? Now, I think there's probably folks in the room listening to those numbers and thinking it's not enough. And certainly, I think if we think about a 1.5 degree target, how do we know if it's enough? And Martha, the SBTI work, whether it's SDA work that we're engaged in, sectoral decarbonization approach under the chemical sector, or SBTI flag, there's a lot of work yet to do to really understand the correct targets for climate ambition for a fertilizer company in the value chain. I think, understanding our scope 3, upstream, downstream. So our scope 3 emissions occur primarily as a result of category 11, that's use of products sold. So the application of fertilizer and the land management practices that go with that on fields. The emissions occur as nitrous oxide emissions from nitrogen fertilizer application. And so what we are looking at there, when we are working with growers every day, making recommendations around how to manage nitrogen, how to manage land, so that could include things like soil carbon sequestration from no-till practices or cover crops. Those emissions or potential removal sinks that occur for us in our scope 3 category 11, that is the same emission that a food company is counting in scope 3 category 1. And so I think it becomes really interesting when we start partnering with food companies to learn about how we're both counting these, what the quantification looks like, and we have a partner here in the room that was an early partner. I'd like to recognize Maple Leaf Foods for joining us early in the journey in doing all of this work. So I think we're probably going to talk about challenges later. Yeah. Okay. So that's where we're at right now.
The challenges for
Thank you.
later. Thanks, Michelle. So I would love to go to Nestlé. From the perspective of the fertilizer and fertilizer-related emissions to Nestlé as a processor company, 95% come from value chain. So I think, Michelle, you have a quite a battle to fight going forward. And so we would love to hear a bit more. What's your experience so far, and what are your highlights? And can you share a bit more about Nestlé's approach in terms of successful project implementation for reducing those Scope 3 emission reduction?
Yeah, so maybe to start off, giving a little bit of context about our targets as well, just to help manage and navigate a bit what that means overall in terms of direction we're going. So Nestlé set a net zero target by 2050 and halving its emissions by 2030. So that means needing to set targets at 2025, 2030, and 2050, all in line with the SBTi pathway. And as an ag and food company, obviously the biggest impact comes from the ingredients. A lot of that is driven by land use change and deforestation, degradation. And so a lot of the network, the activities that are happening for the net zero roadmap are around deforestation, tackling regenerative agriculture practices, reduction of fertilizer, and so on. I think the other piece that is really important as a strategy that complements this is our forest positive strategy, which came from a lot of our work, working now almost 10 years on no deforestation. And a lot of the learnings that came with that are these aspects that Martha was mentioning, which is we need kind of longer term strategies that address not just thinking about addressing risk right now, but how do we actually think about addressing it before it even happens, and then also recognizing that it's actually not just addressing the deforestation right now, but seeing how we can play an active role in that space. And that came with a big mindset shift, because we have this angle of how does our supply chain sites actually connect to the larger landscapes that they're part of. So market-based mechanisms are really critical for us to drive that transformational change at that level, and that's why VCI is so important. In terms of how we kind of work, so we have a global team. The most important piece is executing robust projects in our value chain. That's the work we do. The global team supports some of those projects. There are market teams that do that with the guidance of the global documents that are shared with them for them to help make decisions. But I think the most important piece is it's a lot of working and partnering to support farmers make that transition. And I think this is often a voice that is often missed, because we need to make sure we can ask as much as we can or want to from them, but we need to ensure that they are actually part of the journey, and we are just the partner supporting them on this journey. So there's a lot of upfront investment that is required to shift into regenerative agriculture practices, for example. And this is not an easy journey at all. So I think we've had a lot of learnings by implementing a lot of these projects upfront. And co-claiming obviously is part of that. So just a very specific example, in the US dairy space, this was at the very start of our net zero journey. We had shifted a few farmers into the region ag space. And that was when we didn't set up any carbon contracts with them. And what happened is they then used this and went to the carbon credit market. So ultimately, even if we're, as an organization, are trying to support that transition, in the end, we can't really make the claim. So the learning for us was really about how do we actually set up the right expectations with farmers on the ground as well. How do you communicate that proactively? So yeah, a lot of learnings definitely on this journey.
Yeah, interesting. And I think as we come out from the claims lab today and the role play, it's interesting also to hear basically how can you avoid to have stranded assets there, and how can you make sure that your investments have return, right, in terms of claiming. Thank you.
Can I just add quick?
Yeah, sure.
I think it's also important that this is definitely a space where there will be challenges and learning. So I think we also just need to accept the fact that we're kind of acknowledging that this is a space where that may happen. And it's about finding the right solutions, partnering, learning from that, and being able to have these type of conversations as well.
Exactly. Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Michelle. All right, so let's continue on the company's flow. So I would like to go to Autumn from Mars. Mars is one of the founding members of the VCI. We have been working together for many, many years by now. We have heard Kevin already, the new pledge, the net zero, new ambition. So Autumn, can you tell us a bit more about that? And can you, let me grab the right questions. Can you elaborate also about the theory of change that underpins Mars approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm taking furious notes up here because I've been asked to report back in the main session later. So I've got to make sure I really capture my panelists' comments well. So I don't normally do that during panels. So you've heard a bit about Mars and our commitment to reduce our emissions 50% by 2030. That's all emissions in, and it's supported by flag targets set in line with the SBTI guidance. So we're deep into that as well. Our theory of change, you heard a bit about this from Kevin, right? So he's set me up well. Is really focusing about what is actually that math, the important emission reduction and removal math that's happening on the ground. And going back to some of the comments about asking the right questions and then getting to the answer, as we think about how do we make sure that impact is happening on the ground and at a sector and jurisdictional level, how do we make sure that there is a just transition and sort of equitable sharing of benefits with farmers, and how do we make sure that we're using resources efficiently? When we think through all those principles, mass balance and market-based approaches are a really obvious tool to help make sure we're achieving what we want to achieve. And so that's a bit why we think mass balance is really important and why we've been part of this work for so long and are such fans of VCI's work. I also wanted to share, just for a little bit of context, we do have right now 2 projects that are going through the various parts of the VCI and Sustain Cert system. So we had one project to reduce emissions from rice in Spain using alternate wetting and drying that just got validated. And we have another project in Australia with the Sustainable Food Lab that is working with VCI to figure out how to really construct their system. Because that one really has a lot of co-claiming baked into it. There's both our grain suppliers involved and companies like Mars and even retailers. And so it's really deep in that question of how do you transfer the reporting of these impacts through the value chain. But I think both of those programs also show the need to be quite flexible and agile in this space, and also really the importance of this work we're doing. That project in Spain is on hold at the moment because there's not enough rice or not enough rain to grow rice in that region. So it's fully on hold. It's been actually going through validation while there's no rice growing. So it really just highlights how interconnected this need to both adapt and to mitigate are.
Thank you. Yeah, we are deep dive into the discussions, and thank you so much, Autumn. And we will get to that in a bit in terms of also the safeguards and what are the credibility criteria there. But let me turn to Kai as we talk about verification as well. Sustain Cert plays a crucial role as the climate verifier. Kai, could you tell us a bit more about how is Sustain Cert trying to ensure credibility in terms of co-claiming? We have heard from Autumn in terms of mass balance, market-based mechanisms earlier. Can you share a bit more with us?
Yep, perfect. Thanks for that question. So basically, the idea is we're, as assurance provider, we want to provide really the credibility that there was an impact happening, but we also want to incentivize any kind of value chain decarbonization. And that is happening through actually providing some service and products that enable that. And so what we're thinking is that there needs to be some kind of safeguard. So Marion was talking about that earlier, which is kind of this dual factor credibility, right? So we see there needs to be a credibility on the outcome, the mitigation outcome. So that's where we are following basically like the different carbon credit standards, the methodologies there, the quantification approaches to make sure that we have a credible impact on the ground. But then the other important one is all related to how do you actually claim and report on that. And that goes in the, and there is a bit of disconnect between the two, because one is based on the product kind of accounting, and the other one is more based on a scope 3, you know, like LCA kind of accounting, like through the greenhouse gas protocol. And so the way we want to bridge that is by providing some kind of safeguards that go into, that define how we can do allocation, how we can do attribution, how we are actually providing a proof of sourcing, because we always want to link the impact back to a good, right? It's important for us to not have just a global debundling, a kind of book of claim, but we want to go for the mass balance approach, basically. And then also enabling kind of like this calculation of the inventory by not affecting part of the inventory where it's not credible that an impact could have happened. So that's kind of the safeguards that we have in place there.
Thanks, Kai. And could you tell us a bit more, what do you mean by proof of sourcing and why this concept is so important? We have talked with the VCI about supply shed, with especially food and ag now. We're looking at factory sheds in terms of the apparel. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so as I said before, basically the idea is we want to avoid some kind of book of claim or like a global debundling. And so the proof of sourcing is really there to link basically the impact to a specific good. And that means also following the good through, let's say, the whole value chain. So that means showing that if you are someone that is sourcing, let's say, soy oil, that you're able to prove that you're aware, like infecting basically something where the soybeans are coming from. So that is related to the production of the soybean. And that's where you need to provide this proof of sourcing. So that's what we see as a second really important pillar of the credibility. Not just the impact, but actually showcasing that someone that wants to claim has the right to claim by providing this proof of sourcing.
So talking about the criteria in terms of credibility criteria, Marta, I'm looking at you. Can you tell us more about your perspective in terms of what do you think credible claims or co-claiming in terms of when we talk about shared value chain intervention and shared efforts? What's your perspective there?
So, I mean, I think I kind of highlighted one already of really making sure that you have free, prior, and informed consent as you're pulling this claim through. I think the other thing I might highlight is, and Michelle brought this up somewhat, that I am getting a little bit nervous about how much kind of pay for performance systems are being discussed and very little pay for readiness. And this, because the upfront investment is so much, there needs to be both shared risk in getting to the performance and then shared benefit in the performance. And a lot of the discussion that I hear is all focused on, well, I assume that the farmer or the country or whatever is going to produce it, and then I'll be there I'll commit dollars ahead of time and I'll be there to swipe it up as soon as it's done. But where is that shared risk and really helping to get to performance? And so I think for me, that is part of making a credible claim, and that also brings us into those enabling conditions. Those have to be applied at a landscape scale. Now we're looking into contribution-based models, right? Like, it just is this, I know I've been a life cycle practitioner now for 15 years. I know everybody hates things that you can't put money or numbers on. I get it. But when you also just keep beating your head against the wall with the same theories of change and not seeing the action, we need to get a little bit more creative and comfortable with like fuzzy edges to try to get over the hump where we've been stuck for quite some time. So again, I don't know if people have young children, but I'm like Daniel Tiger having two feelings at the same time, right? So I think it's this shared risk in getting there. It's shared benefit in the claim. I think it's getting comfortable, like the IPBES report, IPCC, everybody's saying we need these collective approaches. So how can we develop these models that help get us there? Within the SBTN, we reference the Forest Positive Coalition framework, the land scale work, the source up work. I think we have helpful frameworks to do these types of landscape-based approaches, and then through that process kind of share attributional claims where needed or share contributional claims where that's decided. Because what we don't want to do is prioritize the claims over the work and then undo the work, right? The work won't get done because the claims kind of kill it. And we've seen deals like this. Not, I mean, even on protected area work that we've done where one person wants to come in and claim all of the benefits from that particular region, and then everybody else threatens to walk away from that. And like, where is this getting us, you know, based on the urgency that we're all facing? So, yeah, so I think that's where I would leave it, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's a very interesting piece in terms of the landscape work. We are touching on these elements through the claims lab, and it's it's quite complex, right? But eventually, as you say, Martha, is we shouldn't prevent action, right? We shouldn't prevent companies to move forward in terms of claiming. So, in speaking about that, Michelle, and speaking about the barriers and the challenges we are facing, of course, when it's about co-claiming, it's a lot of collaboration efforts. It's a lot of partnerships and stakeholder engagement. What have been your barriers and maybe your lessons learned? What would you advise to other companies?
So first of all, Martha, I really agree with your comments about the investment up front it takes for partners to be prepared to be able to credibly prove an intervention in co-claiming. It's a really long runway. And we're also, you know, with a project in validation and with a partner that has had patient investment. And I think, so one of the barriers to scale is until we get validated and verified outcomes, when we are collaborating and we need to do massive collaboration, it's hard to have the confidence to invite other partners in and grow a project when you can't say with certainty, here's the outcomes we're going to deliver. In terms of barriers, I think there's an interesting kind of barrier and maybe elephant in the room, which is there's been a lot of skepticism around agricultural greenhouse gas credits, impact, the opportunity to create reductions and removals. And so one of the reasons that I think that this has been kind of a topic of debate is that agriculture is a biological system. There is a lot of inherent natural variability. And when we are trying to measure and we're looking at maybe greenhouse gas accounting systems that initially were scope 1 and 2 based on industrial manufacturing processes, and we try to take the rules of kind of what's the level of certainty and variability and apply that to a biological system, now we're doing all kinds of things, including massive scale and sampling and trying to figure out ways statistically to prove the certainty of the impact. And we're not thinking about the variability of the natural resources that agricultural production is relying on. We haven't thought about the high degree of variability, not just in the resources, but in the methodologies that we have for measuring things like soil carbon. And as we get really excited about remote sense technologies, we have to remember that we're validating those technologies against the current standard practice of measurement in the field for soil carbon, which has 30% variability if you're doing a great job. So there's barriers within the system that I think we haven't even really scratched the surface, because in some ways they go against the principles that are set in place for good greenhouse gas accounting around uncertainty assessments. So some of those are challenges. And then I think, Michelle, you made a really good comment about thinking about the barriers when you're having the conversation with the grower, the investment, the risk, and the skepticism the grower has when there's 2 different or 3 different companies approaching them on carbon programs with a lot of different terms around carbon programs. So that creates a hurdle in itself. Then I think the really obvious ones, and then I'll wrap up because others will have great things to say, but other barriers, really these quantification methodologies. I think, you know, IPCC, maybe the standard setting is it's got to be peer reviewed, publicly available, a lot of data behind it. And when you start talking about site-specific agriculture and the projects and research, those quantification methods are usually quite regional and specific, and there's not always that level of scientific publication available. So then an auditor who does not have a strong agricultural knowledge background in the validation and verification body is asked to look at this quantification methodology, and they're not confident. So they're not going to approve the impacts from those projects. There's just lots of hurdles in the way of us being successful. And then I think maybe for me, the final one that I'll touch on is mechanisms to deal with additionality. I think in some of the standards bodies, the tendency has been to set a business as usual threshold. And in agriculture, it's really difficult to deal with those business as usual thresholds. In some cases, the standards body says if the practice is adopted at a 40% rate, then that's business as usual. And there's 60% of the land base out there that we're not going to look at for creating an emission reduction opportunity on, a carbon sink opportunity on, because the standard setter says it's already a business as usual. So there's lots of challenges and barriers, but judging by the passion, the number of people in the room, the great conversations we've had with really qualified, deep knowledge experts today, there's going to be ways around this. It's just going to take that patient and continued work, and maybe more confidence and more flexibility on all parts of the value chain to make this work.
And we are here for that, isn't it? So Michelle, looking at you, of course, perhaps you want to reply to Michelle's comment there, and perhaps could you share with us a bit more about Nestlé's approach when it comes to co-claiming, and what's your perspective about credible co-claiming?
Yeah, maybe just adding a few additional comments to what you just said, Michelle. I do think one of the things that we're seeing is making, like, the biggest hurdle is ensuring that the incentives are set up the right way for the farmers as well. And, you know, it's not always easy when we had an example, these are projects from other people on the team that have been working on it, but with some of the cereal farmers that we worked with, and then the first time you go there and you ask them, well, can you help us implement these regenerative agricultural practices that we think are, you know, what is important in this context and where we need to go. So you always need to consider the local context as well within even those solutions. And the farmers, yeah, that's great, yeah, let me try this. And the next time you go back and say, well, now we need actually the footprinting of this, so can you also help us like collect all of this? And then he says, oh yeah, okay, let me help and learn, you know, getting there. And then the next time you go there and say, well, now we actually need soil footprinting and soil measurements and da-da-da, and then obviously it's at one point it's just a hard no. So I think we need to, you know, recognize farmers are not going to become carbon accounting people. Like, that's not their role. They need to continue to produce food, and that's what we need them to do. So I think it's always important to keep that in mind. Yeah, so co-claiming perspectives, I think we're exploring a lot of those topics on the landscape level. That's one of the areas, again, like Autumn, you were saying, market-based mechanisms are key for this. So we're also exploring with VCI how that works, and VCI is obviously at the supplier level a key one. So we're super excited, and kudos for all the work that went into that, because you know, it's a complex topic. It's something that is we don't have all the answers yet to that, and it's something where we need to continue to push. I think one key thing that we still have an opportunity to is figuring out how do we move from just this farm to farm area assessment to actually this sourcing landscape piece, and including maybe a sourcing region and then a larger region around that, and how do we make that transition. But yeah, I think collaboration and finding ways to co-claim things and bringing partners together will be the way forward in the future.
Great. So we have touched lots of interesting topics, the role of the farmers. Are we looking to make them carbon accounting people? No, we're not. What are we expecting? What is the role, and how can we collaborate? How can we enhance collaboration to make it work, right? So Autumn, I would like to turn to you and hear also from you what have been your lessons learned building on what Nutrien and Nestlé shared, and what's your vision in terms of credible co-claiming? You just mentioned before mass balance and all the efforts from Mars. Can you share a bit more with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can imagine, our sustainable sourcing teams right now are very hungry for guidance because there's a lot of ambiguity, and they're out there working with farmers, starting programs to implement regenerative agriculture practices and other climate smart agriculture practices. And so I've been doing some work to try to distill where we are at this moment for them. And so I just wanted to share a bit, maybe kind of how I had distilled VCI for them as we think about mass balance. And I put it as being 5 principles, right? First, that when they're building these programs, they need to be looking at a like product, right? The same crop that we buy, not a different kind of wheat, the same kind of wheat that we buy, right? And of course, looking at the amount that we buy, and being skeptical of if something seems too good to be true. It probably is, right? And the second being, of course, that link to the supply shed that Kai, you mentioned, that being really crucial. And of course, there's a lot of questions still on how we define supply sheds and what you do in supply chains that have multiple supply sheds, but really maintaining that link to really our physical supply chain, even as we use mass balance within it. And thirdly, going back to that this is not a booking claim or a carbon credit, it's really coming to us through the impact factor of what we purchase, using some of the methods that Value Change Initiative is pioneering for us. And fourth, and this one I'm going to rephrase already, I called it right to claim, which is really about that transferability of impact that we heard about earlier. But we were in a workshop last week, Martha and I, on the land sector and removals guidance, and that phrase caused a lot of confusion. The wording of right to claim made people think about carbon credits and sort of extreme financial approaches to this. And so, we started to move towards something more like a right to report. So I wonder if we should be talking about co-reporting, not co-claiming, or spending more time brainstorming, because that was just our quick solution in the moment, right? So making sure that we do have that connection back to the farmer, to that land management area, that there is that free, prior, informed consent and the right, transferability of that impact through the value chain. And then the fifth being that we're contributing. That, I think there's, as Michelle rightly raised, there's some things to debate about things like additionality and causality, and also whether those are the right answers for the problem, but really making sure that we are contributing to the changes that have happened on the farm and to continued change on the farm, because we know we have a lot to do and we need to be taking action everywhere we can. So it's not just getting the first few practices, but continuing the journey with farmers on the ground. So yeah, using those kind of 5 principles to help our teams understand what we're talking about when we talk about well-managed or credible mass balance, as we see more of these initiatives and some of the other initiatives we heard about from Vera scale up over time.
Yeah, really exciting. The right to report, we will bring it to the Claims Lab, of course. Our next session is in November, and we will make sure that we perhaps can create a definition on that and test it with the members. I think it's an interesting point. Maybe, because you mentioned the land sector removals guidance piece in the workshop in Washington. Is there anything that you would like to share on that? I know there was very intense discussions on the different requirements that will be put forward. We were facilitating one on traceability, but just some insights for the public that couldn't perhaps be there.
So with the caveat that there were no decisions made in the meeting, all of this goes back to the technical working group and then to the advisory committee before anything would be final. So please do not make any major financial decisions based on anything that I share here. Don't make any financial decisions based on anything I share ever. But I think I would say that I felt that the intention is there to figure out how to incentivize working land action and kind of the one bump out, whether it's sourcing region, production area, landscape. We're still trying to figure out exactly how to define it, how to connect them, and how to make sure that we plug the loopholes. Not every loophole, and goodness knows we're never going to do it, but like, how do we plug the big ones that we really need to make sure that someone is not using it to do like effectively a net deforestation target where I am cutting over here and I'm planting over there, because there are some companies who will do that, right? So I would say we did not find all the solutions, but I do feel like the intention is there to figure out how to make this work. And so that to me was a big step forward, and I feel pretty excited about that. On the other stuff, I feel like it was so many little things. I mean, I think we resolved 60% of the issues going into this meeting, and so we had only 40% left, and I think we resolved 50% of the 40%. So we've got about 20% of the work left to do. There's still some big, hairy questions in this, but again, yeah, I think we are slowly closing all of the different questions that we started. What would you add?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that there was some progress, as you said, on looking at using sourcing region approaches and sort of recognizing change beyond just the tiny little field that the crop is grown on. So I think it'll be interesting to see where that lands in the end. And there was also some openness to allowing some of the solutions to manage risk, like buffer pools or reserve pools, something like that is good to be aware of. Yes. So yeah, it does feel like a lot of decisions were made, but there's a few big open questions still. Some of the meatiest questions are still open.
And maybe, I mean, to the point that was brought up on the previous panel by Owen, market mechanisms need to solve a specific problem. We should not be hunting around trying to insert these things in places they don't belong. And what I do feel like came out of last week is a very clear, like, where are the problems that we have within the system that we're in, and now exploration on, okay, how do we solve these problems? What are the appropriate mechanisms that we can use to address these? So I do feel like a lot of clarity on the problems that was gained as well.
Well, thanks for that. I know this is a bit off script, so thanks.
Pankaj is okay with what we've said.
But no, I mean, it's really encouraging to hear that at least that 60% has been solved, and the 20%, 50% of that 40% is being solved. And so I know it's a couple of months to go. I think it will be published in May 2024. So we look forward to diving into that as we launch the next Food and Agriculture Working Group in November. Great. So Kai, going back to you, in terms of credible co-claiming, we talk about supply shed, we talk about market-based mechanisms and the role and the safeguards in terms of how to verify impact. Can you share a bit more with us, and perhaps like what can we expect? What's next there?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is also what we hear here is there are a lot of challenges in different companies to actually, like go for scope 3. But I think we can also harness these challenges because scope 3 has this shared responsibility, right? And if we talk about a shared responsibility, then we also have this chance to actually do this co-investment and do this co-claiming. And so for the safeguards, as I said, I think it's really important to have like that molecule, what Pankaj was saying, right? Like trying to get to that part, but then also have the same safeguards on the and I like this reporting, like this right to reporting. I think that's an important, because at the end of the day, what we want to do is we want to have a credible outcome that goes into a scope 3 report, right? That's what there's of course also the whole climate change, and we want to try to solve that, obviously. But I mean, in a way to incentivize like actions in scope 3, that's what we have to have, like the credible reporting. And so for that, I think what we can really leverage is LCA methodologies, because they are actually allowing to do these kind of things like allocation or like recalculation of impacts, even going beyond carbon, right? So that's maybe the future, but in the future we can imagine that we want to go to other impact categories like biodiversity or deforestation or whatever else we wanna look at. And then the last thing that I want to say is basically like our understanding is that we don't really want to close doors in terms of, you know, putting like limits. I mean, there are certain limits that we need to respect, like we don't want negative emission factors, we don't want like some kind of offsetting. But the other things that we can cover is basically done through an uncertainty framework. So we believe that if we had an uncertainty framework that allows to enter with maybe some average or secondary data, but we can reflect this outcome on how much this would actually impact the kind of credibility, then we could give kind of incentives to go to a better data quality without actually closing the door for impact that should happen now. So yeah, that's what I feel.
Thank you, Kai. Perhaps just to follow up quickly, can you tell us a bit more? What do you mean about uncertainty framework? I know that we have deep dived a bit in the Food and Agriculture Working Group output back in February. We had lots of discussion with GGP on our uncertainty work. Can you share with us a bit more?
Yeah, so the uncertainty framework that I was referring to is actually also coming from LCA. So it's called a pedigree matrix, and basically it looks at the representation of the data, like in terms of geographic or whether in temporal resolution or technology. And based on that and based on empirical research, we can actually assess how much does that deviate from the kind of true value that we're looking for. And by that, we can basically assess the uncertainty of a specific impact all across the like different parameters and models that we're running. And by that, we can at the end use a conservative approach to say like, this is the impact that at the moment we feel is credible to put into a scope 3 report. And then once we go to higher or better data quality or more like elaborate methods, then we can kind of move towards more impacts. So that's, yeah.
Thank you.
And that's for the future, yes.
Yeah, exactly. It's great to build on present to kind of envision what needs to come and what needs to happen. Maybe what Kevin said, no? What does it take to get there? What does it take? Well, thank you all so much. I think we are almost at time. I just would like to do a final lightning round, perhaps on recommendations, actually. What's your piece of advice as climate leaders, climate experts on, in terms of credible co-claiming? What's your advice perhaps to other companies, perhaps to the VCI or to other standards or frameworks? Shall we start with Michelle?
Sure, I'm happy to start. So I think to, first of all, think about the farm as a system. And the farm isn't growing one crop, they're growing a rotation of crops. And so as we're putting projects together, you have to think about the whole farming system and how to incentivize action across every crop in the rotation. The role of a project representative, an intervention representative in the nomenclature, might be to bring partners into the project that represent every part of the crop rotation, so that when we need to look at incentivizing very expensive practice changes on the farm, we are able to have funding coming from every part of the crop rotation. So I think that's first, is we have to have, I said massive collaboration, but it really goes beyond that. And then I think the best starting point, so just similar to what Michelle had, but best starting point is declare your intentions up front with the partners that you're bringing into the project. What's the level of ambition and integrity? How do you expect to engage, discuss performance with farmers, reward farmers? It's just having all of that understood up front before you get into a project, so that on the back end of the project, you're not trying to figure out, well, what am I paying for and what am I getting as a result?
For me, my closing thoughts would be more directed to VCI and GHG protocol in a way of ensuring understanding really the ground realities and ensuring that we have really pragmatic solutions that allow to drive the action we need at the scale that we need now.
Yeah, I think for me, it's what I said before. It's basically scope 3 has also opportunity. It's the opportunity to have this shared responsibility. And by that, actually meaning if we can come together, like if different actors in the value chain can come together and agree on like a goal and a goal that they can also share in these reports, then I think it will be on a good way, because it will also provide an incentive for companies to do that and the economic benefit. So, yeah.
Yeah, I feel we've got quite a theme going here, but just to keep building on that spirit of collaboration, I think, what's becoming clear is that, and we've known this for some time, we're talking about really deep societal transformation, and that does not just happen because a company goes in and says, I'll pay a farmer $20 a ton to do something. And so we need to make sure that the systems we're building are really supporting, encouraging, having that crowding in of support from all different actors, from companies, from input providers, from NGOs, from governments, from civil society, and we need to make sure that we're supporting that as a theory of change in these landscapes.
Great. So I think from me, I talked about urgency, I talked about agency, so I would end on empathy. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we were not even talking about land sector emissions. Anything that we can get on the books is better than what we had before. And so I think we all need to give ourselves a little bit of grace, because it's the first sector that needs to get to net zero. It's the last one to get guidance. It's spatial, it's complex, it has intercropping, right? Like everything here is backwards. And so I think let's all just do our best, try to solve these problems, but keep going and just really give ourselves grace.
Thank you. So exciting. It's just yeah. I kind of feel the momentum, and I think these panels show like how it's important to, as Marta you just shared, in terms of empathy, but also the collaboration piece, and so yeah. I really would like to thank you all so much for your time here today. So we will wait for the other 2 breakouts to come back in. We will have our fantastic reporters to report on these conversations. It's going to be a hard effort. And then we will have our networking session. So yeah, we will just wait for them to come back. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening.